Hello, everyone. How are you doing? We're going to get started today. Welcome to the Gunn Historical Museum's virtual readings from the archives. Could you give me a thumbs up or a wave if you could hear me? Everyone is muted. Great, you could hear me. And you'll be muted throughout the program. And at the end, I'll unmute you if you'd like to participate in our discussion. If you're new to our virtual programs, this is the third readings from the archives that we're doing over Zoom, and I'm going to read a paper today from our archive. We're fortunate to have these great research papers that the Washington Women's Club wrote in the early 1900s, and I also pulled some photographs from our collection to show you as I'm reading. And after that, we have a brief discussion. Maybe there's some questions you might have or comments. You might recognize some of the places or the families mentioned in this paper. And our program is expected to go for about 45 minutes today. And just to remind you, we are recording this, and a link will be available after the presentation on our website, where you could actually view all of the programs that we've done on Zoom on our website. So if you're interested in checking those out, take a look at those links there. And, you know, we are going to be doing this every 2 weeks. So join us next Monday at 10 o'clock at the same link for our next presentation. With that, I think I would like to get started with today's paper today. And it is titled Reminiscences of Dr. Remus M. Fowler and Some Record of His Family and House, written in 1912 by Edith, Heath, Rossiter. As you sit on the porch of the parsonage in this autumn of 1912 and look over the green lawn at the western hills, you almost forget that a little white house ever stood among the apple trees just across the lane. And lest we forget the good people who lived in the little white house. It is my pleasure this afternoon to tell you something about them and the house they lived in. The house was a modest colonial dwelling, only a story and a half high, possessing a charm and quaintness that only comes with age. In front, 4 slender white columns supported the long sloping roof that ran out over what would have been a piazza had there had been any floor besides the grassy ground. To the south of the house stood a small building, commonly spoken of in olden times as the shop. Tools of all descriptions were stored there, and at the back of the shop stood a stable. The latter 2 buildings were torn down some time ago. The house, for which so many years was the home of Dr. Remus Fowler and his family, was built in 1814 by Mr. Cyrus Winthrop Gray. Mr. Gray succeeded the Reverend Mr. Ebenezer Porter as pastor of the Congregational Church in 1813. His pastorate here was of short duration and stormy while it lasted. He left Washington in 1815 and sold the house that year to Mr. Simeon Baker, who lived in it for 12 years. Mr. Baker sold the house together with a barn and 7 acres of land to Dr. Fowler for $1,250. Dr. Fowler was a younger brother of Dr. Warren Fowler, who was Washington's much beloved physician from 1800 until his death here in 1826. The Fowlers were natives of Torrington, Connecticut, settling there as early as 1750. The Fowler homestead, a few miles out of Torrington, where Remus and his 11 brothers and sisters were born, was standing in 1903. Their father, Noah, was a staunch Whig, giving every penny he could spare to his country during the War of the Revolution. Their mother was an ardent Calvinist. Warren Fowler, the eldest son, was born in 1776. He studied medicine in the office of Dr. Daniel Sheldon of Litchfield and at the age of 18 received a license to practice medicine from the Litchfield County Medical Society, an institution founded in 1765. Soon after that, he moved to Washington as successor to Dr. Hastings. And on October 28th, 1800, he married Polly Hanford of this town. They lived in the house later known as the Hurlburt House, now the Washington Club, and their two sons were born there, Henry in 1803 and George in 1807. Both studied medicine and practiced in other states. The old church records show that Dr. Warren Fowler became a member of the Congregational Church in the Great Revival of 1821. He had a fine tenor voice and sang in the choir. In the year 1826, there was an epidemic of malignant fever, much like typhus in Washington, which robbed this town of many prominent men, among them Judge Brimsmaid, Sheriff Gunn, and Dr. Fowler. Dr. Warren Fowler is buried in the old burying ground on Plum Hill, and the epitaph on his stone plainly shows the esteem in which he was held by the people whose health he cared for so faithfully, and that he was an able physician is shown by the fact that in 1818, he received an honorary degree in medicine from Yale College. The inscription on his gravestone reads, quote, "To the memory of Warren Fowler, MD, a superior and cultivated intellect, eminent professional attainments, distinguished public and private usefulness, affectionate devotion to his family and friends, the confidence and favor of the community won by unyielding integrity and by the exercise of highly social and Christian virtues, could not save the lamented man from the grave. In the meridian of his faculties and in the serenity of hope and resignation, he suddenly died, September 13th, 1826, aged 50, end quote. This epitaph is said to be much like the sermons of the good Mr. Stephen Mason, who was fond of big words and flowery. He lived during his pastorate here in a small house that was the nucleus of the present gunnery. Remus Fowler and his twin brother, Romulus, were born in 1793. Dr. Fowler was proud of telling that he weighed only 2½ pounds at birth, and that he was put in a quart tankard and the lid closed. Another story is that a teacup was put over his head when he was a baby, and the edge of the cup rested on his shoulders. Romulus, spoken of as a youth of much promise, died when he was 14 years old, and at that early age was a student at Yale College. Remus did not go to college. He studied medicine with his brother Warren and also with Parliament, another brother who practiced in Bethlehem. In 1819, he married Miss Harriet Childs of Litchfield. Her brother was a prominent New York physician. The Childs' home, a large house with a gambrel roof that stood on Goshen Road about 2 miles from Litchfield Center, was burned only a few years ago. Soon after his marriage, Dr. Fowler practiced at New Marlborough, Massachusetts, where 2 daughters were born, Jane in 1821 and Mariah in 1823. Mrs. Fowler died in 1824, and 2 years later, Dr. Fowler married again. His second wife was Mary Miller from Torringford, and she also had 2 children, Stanley Fowler, who was born in 1828, and Harriet, who was born 2 years later. Both children were gifted but eccentric, as was their mother. She was a daughter of William Miller, a Hessian prisoner of Burgoyne's army who settled in America after the Revolutionary War. Soon after his second marriage, Dr. Fowler was called to Washington to attend his brother Warren in his last illness. He was with him when he died, and at the urgent wish of the people of Washington, settled here and succeeded to his brother's practice. The territory that a country doctor had to cover in past times was a large one, his visits often taking him 20 miles across the hills, for he was frequently called in consultation, being very clever in diagnosing cases. Often he would spend the night where there was sickness, and it was the accepted thing to ask Dr. Fowler to stay for a meal if his call happened around mealtime, an invitation that was generally accepted, for he did not find his home life congenial. Mrs. Fowler was a poor and indifferent housekeeper, not worrying if the doctor was late in returning home and not troubling herself when he did. The doctor was very fond of mince pie and ate heartily of it when it was good. The pies that Mrs. Fowler made were not popular in her own family, a fact that she could not understand, as she said she put plenty of black pepper in them. The good doctor was friend to rich and poor alike, often taking produce in exchange for services. One family often paid in cheese, another kept the larder supplied with honey. Often he did not make any charge for medical attendance, but that was due to his carelessness in keeping his accounts, as well as to his kind-heartedness of heart. Though he used to say he did not think it right to make money out of people's misfortunes, and he once told Mr. Sheldon Ford that he considered it an insult to be paid, whereupon Mr. Ford replied that it was a pity he was not insulted more often. The doctor often wished he had just enough money to live on that he might cure the sick without charge, for professional enthusiasm was perhaps the chief characteristic of Dr. Fowler. His enthusiasm for his work caused him to say he would like to suffer every kind of pain and have every known disease just to know what it was like. The doctor was exceedingly generous, his family often actually suffering from his generosity to others, and the poor housekeeping of his wife may be explained somewhat by her having very little to do with. One of her economies was wearing a Mother Hubbard wrapper to church, and she dressed her stepchildren in material dyed with hickory stain. In 1834, a degree in medicine was conferred on the doctor by Yale College, but the confidence that the people of Washington had in him was inspired quite as much by his kindly spirit and cheery smile as by the doses he gave. He was his own apothecary, always traveling with his medicine chest and peck measure in which he carried his bottles, under the seat of his buggy, and many a powder and bottle did he taste before he found one he was looking for. One of his favorite prescriptions was blue mass, which he administered in pills the size of a hickory nut. Another medicine he often prescribed was Peruvian bark and wine, and to help this bitter dose go down, he would tell about one man to whom he gave this medicine. The man made very strange noises the next time the doctor saw him, and when asked what was the matter, he said he could bark all right, but could not whine yet. Some of his prescriptions were quite original. In one case, he prescribed in a swing for a whole family, and for one patient who was troubled with insomnia, he sat by her bed and sang to her for over an hour until she fell asleep. Sometimes a patient was very seriously ill, and he would bring Deacon Abernathy with him to the house to pray for the recovery. The doctor had a large fund of anecdote, and his visit would invariably be accompanied by a good story. His laugh was deep and rich and contagious, and people, though sick, would unconsciously join him in his hearty appreciation of his own joke. the little diversion sometimes helping as much as the medicine he left. Many witty sayings are attributed to him. Mrs. Gunn often quoted the doctor's definition of rheumatism, quote, "Rheumatism being the result of original sin, but gout that of actual transgression," end quote. He was a doctor of the old school and did not believe much in sugar pills of homeopaths. On one occasion, when a New Preston physician told him of the merit of some new medicine and urged him to use some of it, he took half the bottle of pills into the palm of his hand and swallowed them all. Some days later, when they met again, the physician from New Preston was almost afraid to ask what effect the dose had upon him. But Dr. Fowler only laughed and said that sugar pills couldn't hurt anybody. Besides being the village physician, Dr. Fowler was also the dentist, extracting all offending teeth with a turnkey, an operation that was much dreaded by young and old. It took real courage or a very bad toothache to lift the queer old knocker with the sphinx-like head and inquire if the doctor was at home. The doctor was a great favorite with children, many of them calling him Grandpa Doctor. He indulged their tastes for sweets to a mild extent, for a search through his pockets never failed to produce a peppermint candy. He had a very large nose and would often embarrass little children by asking if they did not think of him very homely. If they answered in the affirmative, he would reward their regard for the truth by giving them a penny. Mr. George F. Wright, the young artist from Litchfield, who painted the portrait of General Brimsmaid that hangs in the Tower Parlor at the Gunnery, often went to Washington during the 1850s, to see his sister, Adelea, who was a boarding pupil at the Judea Female Seminary. He painted during one of his visits here the portraits of Dr. and Mrs. Fowler that are now hanging in the ladies' parlor of the Congregational Church. Dr. Fowler is represented as a rather heavy elderly man with almost white hair, remarkably large blue eyes, and a very high forehead that wrinkled when he laughed. He is clad in an old-fashioned tailcoat and wears a high stock. The pose was unnatural, and his daughter, Mrs. Leavitt, does not consider the likeness good. A much better picture can be found accompanying the delightful sketch called The Country Doctor, written by Reverend Mr. Newell Meeker Calhoun for the Litchfield County University Club. Mr. Calhoun is a descendant of David Calhoun, a Scotchman who settled in Washington in 1732. It is said that he bought the region known as Calhoun Street for one cow and a calf. The doctor was very unconventional in his dress, sometimes keeping on his bright colored dressing gown when he hurried off on an emergency call. More often, he wore a long black overcoat and a red tippet knotted under his chin. In winter, he sometimes wore as many as 4 coats at once, the longest being put on first, the others graduating up so that 4 layers could be seen distinctly. He drove an ancient brown horse, given to wheezing, and great was the sympathy between master and horse. For Johnny Dargis knew the roads as well as the doctor, who could indulge in a little sleep on the way, knowing that the faithful Johnny would bring him safely home. Dr. Fowler was as unconventional in his ways of thinking as in his clothes he wore, which, shabby and queer as they were, could not hide a certain nobility in his face and bearing. He was a man of excellent intellect, liberal and progressive in his ideas, and interested in reforms and all new isms. He was a real transcendentalist and liked nothing better than to enter into a friendly discussion on the subject. He was also a firm believer in anti-slavery, The Fowlers were musical as a family. The doctor sang baritone in the choir after his conversion in the revival of 1831, and his daughters Jane and Mariah inherited their love for music and their fine voices from him. Hattie Fowler sang, also played very well on the piano, and gave Mr. Arthur Woodruff his first musical instruction. Stanley had a fine tenor voice and often serenaded the girls of the Judea Female Seminary on his guitar. Mariah would often accompany her father on his round of professional visits, and it was not uncommon to meet the doctor and his daughter in their mud-bespattered buggy of bygone style, singing duets quite unconcernedly as they drove. Both Jane and her sister Mariah went to school at the old academy on Washington Green. Later, Mariah went to Rutgers Institute in New York City, staying with her uncle, Dr. Childs, while she attended school. Jane and Wolsey Leavitt were married in 1842 by Parson Hayes. Wolsey Leavitt was the son of Mr. William J. Leavitt, who was Mrs. Julia Leavitt Richards's uncle. He built the house that is now used as the rectory of St. John's Church for his son and his bride. And the old parlor there was the scene of many a pleasant gathering. The Leavitts lived there until they went west in 1855, and their two children were born there, William in 1850 and Helen in 1853. Both children are married and live in Florida. Mrs. Leavitt is now living in Orange City, Florida, a very bright old lady of 91 years, showing a kindly interest in answering inquiries regarding her family. Many people will remember her as the warm friend of Mrs. Gunn, who for so many years spent her winters near her girlhood friend. Mariah Fowler was married in the winter of 1850 to Dr. Seth Porter Ford. Miss Mary Smith attended the wedding as a very little girl and remembers the bride and groom warming themselves by the stove in the church just before the marriage. She also remembers that Dr. Ford became impatient listening to Mr. Hayes's long address and interrupted it by catching hold of his bride's hand, which brought the ceremony to a quick conclusion. The next day, the young people started for the Sandwich Islands, where they were going to as medical missionaries. As they passed through New York, Dr. Childs gave a reception in their honor. Hattie Fowler, the stepsister who had just finished her course at Mount Holyoke, went with them to the islands and remained with them there for 2 years. The trip in those days was a long and tedious one, the journey taking nearly 6 months as they went around Cape Horn. Mrs. Ford was a poor sailor, but her sister found amusement in playing cribbage. Mrs. Ford died in New York City in 1868 at the home of her uncle, Dr. Childs. She is buried beside her father in the cemetery by the Episcopal Church. Dr. Fowler's useful life came to an end on the 1st of March, 1879. He was 86 years old when he died, and up to the very last showed interest in his profession. He told Taylor Platt, who was watching him, that his pulse would be 3 times more. And his last words were, quote, "It has stopped," end quote. Dr. Fowler was a Mason and had a Masonic funeral. Mr. Colton presided at the funeral services and preached a most eloquent sermon on the virtues of the good doctor, who by his honesty and fidelity and devotion to truth had won a deep and lasting place in the hearts of his fellow townsmen. Mrs. Fowler died in 1885, and after the death of her parents, Miss Hattie lived alone in the old home until her death in January 1910. Some years before that, Mr. Cornelius Gold had bought the house and grounds, and in the autumn of 1910, the house was demolished and the land divided between the rectory grounds and the parsonage. In the Gunn Historical Museum at the Gunn Memorial Library is a life-size oil portrait of Dr. Remus M. Fowler, and there is also the companion portrait of his wife. They were painted in 1845 by George F. Wright, who was then 17 years of age. It is not strange that these portraits were poorly painted, but it was not many years before George F. Wright became a noted portrait painter. 19 of the portraits of governors in the portrait gallery of the Connecticut State Library on Capitol Hill were painted by him. He was called the Hartford Portrait Painter, and the governor of Illinois summoned him to that state to paint portraits of its prominent men. He was born in New Preston, Connecticut. And that is the end of our readings from the archives today. This was Reminiscences of Dr. Remus M. Fowler and some record of his family and house, written and read by Edith, Heath, Rossiter at the meeting of the Washington Women's Club on October 7th, 1912. And with that, we can enter our discussion period of the presentation. If anyone has any questions or comments about what they have heard in today's presentation, we ask that you raise your hand, and I'll be able to hopefully see that. And I can unmute you, and we could have a brief chat about what we heard today. Any takers, any questions or comments out there in Zoom world? If you do, raise your hand and I will be able to see that. Okay, I see some Peter's hand. I'm going to try to unmute you, Peter. Hi, Peter, how are you doing?
Hi, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Just wanted to say you did a great job.
Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. No other questions, but obviously it provokes a lot of thinking and we'll get further into it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining us today. We're so lucky to have these really great papers that were written by the Washington Women's Club in the early 1900s, from about 1910 or so through 1930, and they tell us so much about life here in Washington, going back into the 1700s and the 1800s. So it's they're a really great resource to have, and this one especially, touches upon some of the people who lived either in your house or were relatives of the people who lived in your house, the Leavitts. So I hope you found some interesting tidbits in this paper from today.
Thanks so much, Stephen. You
You're welcome.
really did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments out there? Feel free to raise your hand and I could unmute you. And I wanted to just say that I found this paper to be especially interesting, especially with the time, that we're facing here in America with and around the world with the coronavirus pandemic. So in this paper, we learned that there was a epidemic of malignant fever that happened here in Washington in 1826. And it took the lives of so many people here in town. And this paper mentions three of them, three of the prominent men that were lost in that epidemic. And it was Judge Daniel Brimsmaid, who we saw a portrait of in the slideshow today, and also Sheriff Gunn. He was John Northrop Gunn Sr. And John Northrop Gunn, he was the father of Frederick Gunn, the founder of the gunnery school here in Washington. So he was lost in this epidemic. And it's interesting because his wife, Polly Ford, died 3 months later in 1827. Our records don't say how she died. I wonder if she also was a victim of the same epidemic. But that left Frederick Gunn, the founder of the gunnery school, an orphan without either of his parents at age 8 in 1827. And he was raised by his older brother, John Northrop Gunn Jr. And his older brother was an ardent abolitionist, and I think that that experience must have had a great impact on shaping Frederick Gunn, losing both of his parents at that very young age of 8 in 1826, 1827. And Judge Brimsmaid, who was also lost in this epidemic, he was the son of one of the first ministers of the Congregational Church, the Reverend Daniel Brimsmaid. And Judge Brimsmaid's son was General Daniel Bourbon Brimsmaid. They like to use the name Daniel throughout many generations in that family. And General Daniel Bourbon Brimsmaid's daughter was Abigail Brimsmaid Gunn, and she was the wife of Frederick Gunn, the founder of the gunnery schools. So two of their ancestors in their family were lost in this epidemic of malignant fever in 1826 here in Washington, and they said it was like typhus. I'm not great with medical history, but does anyone know what malignant fever is or what typhus is? If anyone out there does, feel free to raise your hand and I could unmute you. I'm not too sure exactly what it was, but I did a little looking around, and it appears that there may have been it may have been some type of infectious disease that was transmitted by ticks, mites, or fleas, or lice. So that is how that disease may have been spreading throughout the Washington, Connecticut community in 1826. So I think that just shows us that while we're experiencing a very difficult and painful time with the coronavirus here in Washington and throughout the world here in 2020, that these epidemics and pandemics have happened before throughout our history, and that we just need to remain strong and stay safe, and we will all get through this as they have in the past here in Washington, Connecticut. Any other questions or comments that anyone has? I see, hi, David Babington and Mrs. Babington, how are you doing there? Thanks for joining us. So I had another comment. It was very interesting, I think, that this paper mentioned that the second wife of Dr. Fowler was Mary Miller, and that her father was a Hessian soldier who remained here in Washington, Connecticut after the Revolutionary War, or in this area. And does anyone know who the Hessian soldiers were? I'm wondering if anyone out in the audience is interested in sharing some information about the Hessians here who were here during the American Revolution. And I may put David on the spot if David's interested. Hi, David. Are you interested in telling us a little bit about who the Hessians were? And Mary Miller's father was apparently one of these Hessian soldiers.
Well, I mean, the Hessians were hired soldiers by the English during the American Revolution. And when some of them ended up staying in the US after the American Revolution, some of them had been captured by the Americans. And when they were offered an opportunity to return to Germany or to one of the German states, they often declined that because they found conditions to be pretty nice here in what became the United States and stayed here. And so, became members of the communities in which they lived in. So it's possible that Mary Miller's father, or Muller perhaps, might have been actually, a prisoner here in Connecticut and just stayed here after the Revolution. But, it's speculation. Miller's being a fairly common name would be a little tough searching, but the name might have actually been Muller originally.
Sure, thank you. And yeah, we haven't really looked into him, so that's a future research project for us. And I know I've come across here in the archives that there's a house in Washington that's referred to as the Hessian House. And it's located on Romford Road in Washington, not too far from Rumsey Hall School. And, we haven't really done too much research into that house. There's so many projects to research, but I wonder who that Hessian soldier was that lived in that house. We'll have to do a little bit more research into that and see if we could find anything. I'm trying
Stephen,
to. Yes.
Stephen, I wanted to ask you about, I guess Walt Woodward is going to be doing a Zoom presentation for the library, on May 26th, 6 o'clock?
Yeah, yes, yeah, definitely, yeah. Our state historian, Connecticut state historian, Dr. Walt, is going to be talking about his new book, which I see you have a copy of there. Do you want to hold it up?
Yeah.
Hot off the presses.
Yeah, it's very entertaining, very entertaining. I'm reading a chapter about the founder of Dartmouth College and his dealing with Native Americans and educating Native Americans, including a fellow named Occam, who was a minister, a Native American minister. And I think Walt Woodward has an interest in this Reverend Wheelock, because Reverend Wheelock lived in the town where he lives now. But it's it's a great book. It's very entertaining. He writes really well. He also has a daily This Day in Connecticut History program that I get on Facebook, which is very interesting. And I think it's a podcast too, but I'm not much into podcasts. I read stuff. I like rather reading stuff than listening to people. But it's a very good book.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoy it. And Walt has some incredible posts. I'm signed up by email, so you could sign up for daily email posts from him. And he shares what was happening in Connecticut at different periods on that specific day in our history. And it's really fascinating how much great history there is here in the state of Connecticut. So everyone should go to the Gunn Library's website, and you could get the Zoom link to his presentation that he'll be giving coming up this month for us. And any other questions or comments from the audience out there? If you do, put your hand up and I'll unmute you. I have a few more things that I wanted to mention before we wrap up today. I found this to be a really fascinating paper, and I'm looking at my notes. So the author of this paper was Edith Heath Rossiter, and she was the wife of Eric Rossiter. So he is the noted architect who lived here in Washington, Connecticut, was a student of the gunnery, and returned here after he graduated in the first class of the School of Architecture. I think it was at Cornell University, and he built a summer home for himself. And while his home was under construction, he realized that there was a logging company that was going to clear cut some of the forest nearby. And so he put the construction of his house on pause, and he used those funds to purchase that land from the logging company and thereby preserving it. And this land he eventually gave away he formed a land trust, and that became the Steep Rock Association. So we have Eric Rossiter to thank for Steep Rock, which many of us are appreciating and utilizing, especially during this time of quarantine during the pandemic. So that was an interesting note that his wife wrote this paper that we heard today, and they lived on Kirby Road, and their house, The Rocks, is still standing there. And trying to see what else I have here. So I also found it interesting that, Dr. Fowler's house was located on Parsonage Lane, where the current parish hall of St. John's Episcopal Church is located. And Parsonage Lane gets its name for the Congregational Church's parsonage, which their minister used to live in on the right-hand side, basically across the street from St. John's Church's parish hall there. So that house is still standing. It's no longer the parsonage for the Congregational Church, but the minister of the Congregational Church lived there, and the minister of the Episcopal Church lived in the Rectory, right on the corner of Green Hill Road and Parsonage Lane. So that road in town was the residence of the ministers of both of those churches. So I found that to be interesting, and that's how that road gets its name. It was also interesting how I found it interesting how it said that the pastor of the First Congregational Church, Reverend Cyrus Winthrop Gray, who built Dr. Fowler's house, or had it built in 1814, that he had a short and stormy pastorate here. There's a lot of discussion of those short and tumultuous pastorates here in Washington, and I'm not too sure what caused him to leave town quickly in just 1 year in 1815, but that's something else that we could look into in the future and see what was causing that turmoil. Any other questions or comments out there from the audience? If you do, feel free to raise your hand. I have a couple more things I wanted to mention because there were just so many interesting tidbits in this paper. So it said that Dr. Fowler loved eating mince pie. This is something that I have never tried, but I'm wondering if anyone out there has ever had mince pie, and if you could describe what it is to us, because I am not familiar with it at all. Is there anyone out there that has had mince pie before that Dr. Fowler enjoyed so frequently? David or Mrs. Babington, have you ever had mince pie?
Oh, yes, it's mincemeat pie that we used to have.
Oh, really?
It isn't sweet, but it's very tasty. I recommend it.
Really? And what are the ingredients in there? So it sounds like there's some type of meat in there. Is there a special kind of meat that goes into this pie?
I don't think it's meat at all.
No, it isn't meat.
Oh, it's not meat.
Chopped up, sort of. I can't tell you.
It would be a lot of suet, I would think. Wouldn't
Yeah.
it be suet and nuts and things? I'm not sure.
Nuts and, yeah.
It'd be sort of an alternative to pumpkin pie or, for a holiday. But I remember having it and not really thinking too much of it, I don't think, as a child. But it was something that was served as an alternative to pumpkin pie or ice cream. But I think I usually would have opted for ice cream.
Wow. Now, was it served as more of like a dessert or an actual meal?
Served as a dessert or actual meal, Mother?
It was a dessert.
Interesting. And is it an English-based food, or what country does it come from? Do you know?
I think it's probably English, but I'm not really sure.
Mhm.
So Dr. Fowler was a big fan of these mince pies, but not the mince pies that his wife made, because it said she put too much pepper in them. So I guess you have
to find an old recipe for mince pie and make it sometime.
We'll have to try it. We'll do a historical get together when we're able to gather. We'll serve mince pie to everyone. And we actually have a lot of really great old recipe books here in the Gunn Museum's collection from Washington families going back hundreds of years. So I'm sure we could find a Washington mince pie recipe in one of our recipe books here.
My mother has a recipe book that she got from her mother when we were living in Charleston, South Carolina, from 1950, and it's receipts, not recipes, for what club was it? What was the club that your mother belonged to?
Yeah, it was a.
It was a woman's social club that did good deeds, and it
was a junior league.
Junior league, the junior league.
Yeah.
And apparently it was a fundraiser that this organization, it was a national organization, did. And I've even tried a couple of those recipes. They're not bad, but it's interesting to see, what the regional cuisine was for this area. And of course, they had other recipes in it from other people, but sort of interesting to see, odd recipes that you would never think of, in terms of what people make now versus what would be commonly made then in 1950. That's a long time ago now.
Yeah, it's great. I love looking at the old recipes. We have them, as I mentioned, going back into the 1800s here and even through the 1950s, recipe books and also menus for dinners at events here in Washington. And it's interesting to see how our foodways have evolved over the years. It's really incredible, these dishes that are no longer made today. I would assume that mince pie is probably not the healthiest thing to eat, so we would have to have it in moderation.
Well, it would be like plum pudding or Christmas pudding, which is which is not particularly healthy for you either.
I'm trying to look at my notes out there too. Any other questions or comments from anyone out there? If you do, feel free to raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So I noticed in the paper it said that Dr. Fowler was careless in keeping his accounts. I actually found that we have the account book here in the collection at the museum of both his brother, Dr. Warren Fowler, who had passed away, and Dr. Remus Fowler. And it's filled with really interesting information, the names of the patients that he was visiting here in Washington and what he was being paid and what he was treating them for. So that is an incredibly important ledger that we have. And hopefully, as time goes forward, maybe we'll be able to transcribe and digitize that and dive into it some more and see what people were being treated for here in Washington. And
Stephen,
yes.
You have an international audience. Somebody is listening from Stockholm.
I suspect that is our good friend, Rolf Johansson. I don't see his face, but I think that's Rolf. And he has visited here in Washington several times before. And his grandmother, Rosalie Johansson, came here to Washington, Connecticut in the early 1900s. She emigrated from Sweden and she came here to Washington, and she was a domestic for many of the families here in town. And
you can unmute. Can you unmute Rolf? He wants to talk.
Oh, okay. Oops. Let's see. Oh, thank you. I'm not seeing everything, but I can unmute him. I think I can unmute. I am trying to, but it's not working. Rolf, if you could hear this, I think you might need to unmute yourself. Oops.
There he is.
Oh, there you are. Rolf, how are you doing?
Well, fine, thank you. It was very interesting to hear this story about.
Oh, great. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in. I was going to say that your grandmother was working for many of the families here in Washington as a domestic, and we know that from the postcards that you have that she mailed back to her family in Sweden, and she was working for Dr. Worsby on Wickham Road, and also Herbert Faulkner on Wickham Road. And I also think I recall she was working for a bit for Julia Leavitt Richards, which would be in Peter's house. Peter's joining us today. So it's interesting that we have this great historical connection here across the Atlantic, that your grandmother was one of the housekeepers for Mrs. Julia Leavitt Richards, which is where in the house that Peter lives in today on Green Hill Road.
We're having a problem hearing Rolf. I'm not sure why.
Oh yeah, I'm not, oh, is he muted again?
No, he's not muted, but I can just hardly hear him.
Whoops.
Okay, I don't understand why.
Oh,
There we go. Better. That's better.
That's better. Okay. I can add that my grandma also worked for Dr. Ford.
Right, and Dr. Ford lived in the house next to Peter's house on Green Hill Road, so right across the street from St. John's Episcopal Church. So she was doing housekeeping, right, Rolf?
Yes, that's correct.
And then the interesting thing is she did not stay here in Washington. She is one of the few immigrants from Sweden who ended up going back to Sweden and living the rest of her life in Sweden and having her family there, and your parents and you are still your descendants who still live in Sweden from her.
Yes, that's right.
Well, people did go back and forth. You know, people didn't always stay. A lot of people came over here just to make money and then be able to go home to their home countries.
Actually, 20% of the Swedish immigrants went back to Sweden.
Really?
Mm.
That's a big percentage. I see Peter is raising his hand. Peter, I think you're free
Stephen,
to...
just to say, that was fascinating about the lady from Sweden who worked in this house. And long ago, I would actually love to have her name, because as you know, I do quite a lot on the history of this house and the inhabitants. And to the gentleman who tuned in from Sweden, I want to point out that your country has taken a totally different and very courageous approach to coronavirus from any other country in the world. And I wish you great success in the way you handle it.
Okay.
Stephen, thank you so much. This was very, very interesting.
Her name was Rosalie. I can say Rosalie Johnson. Stephen knows that.
Yes, Rosalie. Yep, Rosalie Johnson. And Peter, we have some research on here that Rolf has shared with us, and I will I'll fire that off to you in an email about who Rosalie Johnson was, and she's actually a distant cousin to
Charlotte.
several here. Charlotte Johnson. Everyone knows Charlotte, right, on Old North Road. So Rosalie is a cousin, and Rolf is a cousin of Charlotte Johnson.
Of course, the name would be Johansson. Johansson was changed to Johnson to anglicize it.
Yes, correct.
Well, I would love to get that name, and very, very much appreciate it. If you can write it for me, Stephen, that would be fantastic, and send it by email. Absolutely fantastic.
Great. Yep, I will do that. I think you'll find it a very interesting
Thank you so
story.
much for this session today.
Stephen,
You're welcome.
Stephen, you can email Peter my email address. And
Oh,
if
great.
you want to ask questions or something.
Great, thank you. Yes, I will do that, and I'll connect the two of you through email. That would be wonderful. And I would like to mention that Rolf has written an incredible book about his family history. It's a historical novel, and he is in the process of translating it into English, and it will be published and available soon in the coming months on Amazon, I think, is what Rolf had told me. And there are chapters about his family's history here in Washington, Connecticut. So I encourage all of you to keep your eyes open for that book that Rolf has written. It's a really wonderful book.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And anyone else out there have any questions or comments? If you do, put your hand up. I have a couple other things I wanted to mention. I just found it really fascinating to hear about how medicine was practiced in Washington back then, and how it has changed so much from how medicine is practiced today, from the house calls and the doctors staying over and having dinner with the family, but also the types of prescriptions he was administering. That blue mass was very interesting. So when I did a little research into that, those were actually mercury pills. And we all know that mercury is not a good thing to be around. So people were ingesting these mercury pills the size of hickory nuts. So that could not have had a good result on them, unfortunately. And boy, that tooth extractor that Dr. Fowler used, that must have been a nightmare. We have that actual tooth extractor here as one of the artifacts in the Gunn Museum's collection, along with Dr. Fowler's medicine chest that you saw, and there are medicine vials in there. We also have a lamp from his buggy that he would ride around town in. So we have these great artifacts here preserved related to him. In addition to those two portraits that you see here, these are both in our collection as well. And I know the paper mentioned that they were not the best paintings, but I love them. And I'm so glad that we have them of Dr. Fowler and his wife, Mary Miller. And just briefly, these were painted by George F. Wright, and he became a really prominent and famous painter and artist. And he was born right here in New Preston, Connecticut. And as we heard, he painted the portraits of many of the governors of Connecticut, which are hanging, I believe, in the Capitol building to this day. And he painted portraits around the country. So George F. Wright is one of the ancestors of the Wrights of New Preston. So another local person who went on to achieve great things here from Washington.
Stephen, I'd like to mention that the research I've been doing on the people that died from the Spanish flu in 1918 did include a Swedish woman who was related to one of the Washington residents. I guess her great-grandfather's second wife was this woman who died of the Spanish flu here in October of 1918, which took a lot of young lives, including very small children. That is the difference with COVID and with the Spanish flu. People that are older are more susceptible to the COVID, and during the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, people more susceptible to it were younger people who didn't have immune systems that the older generation had to it. So it was sort of interesting to find that in the records of here in Washington.
Yeah, it's incredible. I think, was that Helma Swanberg?
Yeah, Helma Swanberg.
And
I remember the name Swanberg. That was somebody Rosa, you know.
Yes, and Rolf, I don't know if you remember Robin McCann, but we met her when you visited here, and when we went over to the church, and it was her, I think, great grandfather's. I'm going to unmute Sally because Sally remembers. Hi, Sally.
Wife, her great grandfather's second wife.
Great grandfather's second wife.
Yeah, the record shows a Hilma Swanberg who was married to John Swanberg, and she died on the 6th of November, 1918 in Washington at the age of 39 years, 6 months, and 1 day old. It's said that she was born in Sweden on the 5th of May, 1880, and her parents were an Alfred Carlson and a Louisa, I couldn't quite make out the last name, but it would look like Lundgren. And, you know, it said that she died of the flu. And I'm a bit challenged with Swedish genealogy with all the different names and different spellings of the names, and the naming patterns at that time for Swedish families is sort of challenging because modern surnames didn't really come into Sweden until fairly late. So there's all these sons and daughters, sons, and you know, you take the name of your father as your family name, and then that happened in the next generation too. So it's a little bit confusing to follow that with some of these families. But I found it interesting that there was a woman who was related to the husband of this woman, and she just happened to die of the Spanish flu in here in Washington, Connecticut.
Interesting to hear. Yes, thank you, David.
Yes,
She's buried in Gaillardsville, isn't she?
Pardon?
Isn't she buried in Gaillardsville?
I'm not sure where she's buried. I sort of, I'm doing research on some of these people who died in the flu, but in my notes on her, I mentioned about Robin McCann being related, and that I was not going to be doing much research on her Swedish genealogy research, because I found Swedish genealogy a bit of a mystery in terms of you know, getting things straight with needs.
David, let me look. I have just gotten home, and so I've just, you know, I've been gone for 4.5 months. I have the note here somewhere, and so.
Okay, yeah, because that would be good to have, because I can add that. I've actually had some success figuring out some of these people who died in the flu, thanks to input from Stephen.
All right. Well, I will find it at some point.
Okay. Yeah, that would be interesting to see. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for all that great research that you guys are doing. There's always every day there's new research to do, and we discover the most amazing stories here at the museum. And with that, I see that we've hit the 1 hour mark, so we should wrap up. Are there any final questions out there or comments from the audience? Oh, do I see a hand there? Oh, let me unmute. Okay, unmute audio. Oops. Okay.
John Turner wanted to say something. Did you see that message?
I don't. No, John, hold on. Let me unmute you. John, hi. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
I'm sorry. On my screen, oh, now I see you.
Can you see me?
Hand.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Go ahead. It's all.
I'm sitting at the kitchen table in front of my mother's copy of Mrs. Beeton, and there are at least 6 recipes for mince pies.
Really?
Including ones for American mince pies. So something that we grew up in as a Christmas dessert, just as much as Christmas pudding. It was winter, so there weren't fresh fruit, so they consisted largely of dried fruit, chopped up, sometimes with meat, but mostly not. Raisins and currants and all kinds of other things, and nuts, but winter fruits.
I remember the currants and raisins.
Mm.
And what time of the year would this would it be eaten?
Most of them mention suet, but one of them is actually a vegetarian, and they don't. Sorry, what were you saying?
John, what time of the year would mince pies be eaten? Was this something that would be in all year or just at a holiday?
Christmas.
Christmas.
Almost exclusively. That's always, we only saw them once a year.
Okay. And it's would you describe it as a heavy type of dessert that you would eat in moderation, or?
Well, well, I don't know about eating in moderation, but these were not light. I mean, imagine these chopped up fruit and suet and pastry underneath and pastry on top with a little sugar sprinkle before they're cooked. So this is not diet food.
So I think I would go to my great-grandmother's cousin's house at Christmas time, and sometimes there would be an option of having mince pie rather than having Christmas pudding or plum pudding.
Yes, they were an
option. You know, I'm sure they may not have had that originally in the family, but they picked it up because they, you know, from an upper middle class American family, they liked having things English.
Yes.
And I think that's, you know, why that came up. And I never cared for the mince pie myself.
Oh, I love them.
I would like to try a piece. So we're gonna, does anyone around here make mince pie? I wonder if any of the bakeries make mince pie. We'll have to find
Well,
some.
there's the UK Gourmet in Newtown or wherever it is, which is, I find that sort of a contradiction in terms, but.
Oh, come on.
Yes, so we will. We'll make it a point to try it, and or maybe even make one of our own with one of the recipes that John has there over in Woodville. Thank you for tuning in today, John. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. Thank you for doing what you're doing.
You're welcome. Thank you all for joining us, because we wouldn't do it if you didn't join us. So I'm glad you're finding it interesting. And before we leave, I just want to mention to please join us back here in 2 weeks on Monday, June 1st at 10 o'clock. If you use that same Zoom link, it will connect you to our presentation, and the paper I'll be presenting on Monday, June 1st at 10 o'clock is the story of the Wesley House. So it's another really interesting and fascinating story with lots of information about Washington's history. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. And with that, if there are no final questions or comments from the audience, I would like to say thank you for joining us, and please stay safe out there, stay well, and we will see you all in 2 weeks back here on Zoom. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank
Bye,
you.
bye, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you.